link distribution. That's clear.
Sophia, I'm here. Should we just wait a few minutes to start?
I guess that's all right. We can wait.
Yeah, I see a few people popping in, so just we'll wait a couple of minutes.
Yeah, there's people increasing in the live chat also.
Sure, we can just wait a few minutes, no problem.
मैं किसम लिखता तारा लिखा है जी नॉन फॉरेस्ट फॉरेस्ट लिखा है जी so
Okay, it's 2:05, and shall we get started, Sophia?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, good. Thanks. Let me just. Hi, everyone. My name is Karthik Shankar, and I'm one of the faculty at CES. And I work on a range of topics relating to evolutionary ecology and biogeography, which you can find on my website. But today I'm going to be talking to you about evolution. Let me just share my screen, and then we'll get this show on the road. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, it's visible.
All right. Okay, then. So one of the things that's interested us as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, not just recently, but in fact for over a couple of 100 years, are patterns of diversity both at small and large scales. If you look at a map of global amphibian richness across the world, you will see a very stark pattern in these richness patterns, in this richness distribution. The dark red on this map represents a large number of species, and the lighter colors, green and blue, represent a lower number of species. And as you can see over here, the pattern is quite obvious that there's a sort of a middle area or the equator, or what we call the tropics, that have this much greater species richness than as you move away from the equator to the poles. That is towards the higher latitudes. You get a very, very similar pattern with plant species richness. You get a pattern that's almost identical to amphibians with fish richness. And actually, this was known even in the 18th century, when naturalists of the time had pointed out that the species found in what they call the torrid zones were very different from what the species they encountered in the temperate zones, for example, in Europe, where most of them came from. So we can start by asking this question: what causes diversity? And as we already noted, some areas, some parts of the world, such as the tropics, have more species. But as you can see from this map of biodiversity hotspots, that even within the tropics, some areas have higher diversity than others. And I'm going to ask you to kind of look at this map for a second and maybe write down on a piece of paper what you think is a common feature of many, not all, but many of these red shaded areas that are designated as biodiversity hotspots. What is special about them? Now, that is a representation of diversity in space, but we can also think of diversity across what we call clades. Now, what is a clade? A clade is a group composed of an ancestor and all of its descendants. And we'll see a few more examples of this through this talk. In fact, we'll see many such examples. But I just want to compare two clades over here. One is a group of reptiles called Sphenodon, and these are about 200 million years old. And depending on, some people say there are two species, some people say there's just a single species. But regardless of that, in 200 million years, this entire clade has just one or two species. On the other hand, there's this other clade to your right, which are of birds, and birds evolved much more recently. Birds, in the last, let's say in the same time frame as roughly 150 plus million years. But this group has 8,000 to 10,000 species, or perhaps at the latest count, maybe more than 10,000 species. Now, why is it that two groups that have been evolving for the same amount of time where in some cases, there's just 1 or 2 species, or maybe 10, 20, 50, it doesn't matter, because there are others such as birds where there are 10,000 species, others such as snakes where there are 4,000 to 5,000 species. And the diversity of these clades is not really explained by the amount of time that they have been evolving on Earth. Now we can put these together and look at what are called evolutionary radiations. And these are found in a number of different places and groups. You have Hawaiian honey creepers, these plants called bromeliads, cichlids, these lizards called anoles in the Caribbean, the birds in the Madagascar called wangas. And all of these are groups in which there's tremendous diversity, but also that has evolved in a single location. So in a way, we can look at diversity in a particular point as being all that has happened in evolutionary time in that clade, in that region, but also the effect of things finding their way there. So diversity in a space on hotspot can be the process of diversification, what's happened in clades, plus the biogeographic process of dispersal. And what we're going to do today is spend some time trying to understand how this happens. Just to give you a couple of more local examples from frogs of the Western Ghats, which several people in India have studied, including several of my students. I want to take a couple of groups as examples. One is a group of called bush frogs. They're essentially part of a large family of tree frogs. And when I did my PhD, I think there were like 10 to 12 known species from the entire Western Ghats. Today, there are over 60. And this came about, of course, through the work of many biologists. The interesting thing about many bush frogs is that they're quite dramatically different from each other morphologically. And if you see these, you're like, oh, wow, yeah, of course, those are different from each other. But another student of mine worked on a group called Nyctibatrachus, or wrinkled frogs or night frogs. And actually, these guys largely look, if you look at Nyctibatrachus of a similar size, they look so similar to each other that they're very hard, often even for taxonomists, to tell apart. So you have these two groups that are both very diverse. Nyctibatrachus as well has over 40 species. And Rochester's that has over 60 species. One has morphological differentiation, the other doesn't. But then you have other frogs in the Western Ghats, such as this one, which was described quite recently, which has just a single species and has been evolving for perhaps the same amount of time as Nyctibatrachus, or give or take. And there's this even more ancient frog that was on the Indian mainland even before we split from Gondwana, which is so over 100 million years. And this again is represented by just 2 known species today. So like the example that I gave you with birds and tuataras, at a much smaller scale, even within a group of, say, frogs or within a group of birds, you'll find that some clades or some genera have diversified massively in the same geographical area, in the same period of time. There's 50 to 60 to 100 species. And there's another one that arrived there at the same time that just has 1 or 2 species. So what's going on? But before we sort of look at evolution itself, I like to briefly dwell on how we got here in terms of our understanding of the field. And for that, we have to go a little ways back. Now, about 2,000 plus years ago, Aristotle had actually started this process of classifying objects, and Aristotle was using the same principle to classify living and non-living things. And he had this principle called logical subdivision. So you take any object and there's a general category, such as furniture, and you can divide furniture into tables and chairs. And then you take the next step and you go to tables and you say, now table becomes my general category. I can have round and square tables, or wooden and metal tables, right? So he used this also for classifying lots of, 500 plus animal species. Now, about more than 1,500 years, nearly 2,000 years pass. Not much happens in the domain of science. In the 15th century, what we consider modern science begins to appear in the form of the Copernican revolution, Copernicus proposing the heliocentric view of the world, which is, the planets revolve around the sun and not that everything revolves around the earth, Galileo's physics, and so on. At around this time, some of the naturalists, one person in particular called John Ray, arrives at Cambridge. He comes from very modest beginnings, but he slowly starts describing plant species using this Aristotle's principle and describing them based on their features. A student, Francis Willoughby, studies with Ray, and as we know today in research, you need money. Willoughby came from a wealthy family. He had money to fund their research. They traveled all over England and Europe, and Willoughby's interest was in birds, and they start working on the classifying birds, and their book Ornithology was published after Willoughby's death. And they start classifying this on the basis of structure, so beak, foot features, overall size, and so on. And you can see some of the original illustrations over here. And some of the groups and some of the species that they actually described nearly 400 years ago are still valid today. And the other interesting thing about Ray and Willoughby was that even at that time, they had started to identify the fact that something about this idea of what a species was something to do with reproduction. So Ray himself says that the most important features for identifying plants are those related to propagation, so seeds and so on. So they've already started relating the idea of what a species is to reproduction, but equally for the first time in history, in Western history at least, they're beginning to classify organisms not on the basis of relationship to us, but on the basis of some features that they had. And that led them to an interesting question, which is, why did animals have so many different features? If the form was different, there should have been a function related with it. And this was not a question that had been asked before, as obvious as it seems. I always like to mention in the passing that it was, of course, then and now less, hopefully less as the years go by, but certainly then and for centuries a male-dominated field. But there were some early women naturalists. Maria Sibylla Merian, for example, was a German-born illustrator and naturalist, and traveled to Suriname with her daughter by herself at the in the late 1600s, which is pretty remarkable. And was one of the first to document the metamorphosis of the butterfly. The next figure who kind of makes this significant contribution to this whole field, there's several. There's I don't talk about all of them. There's the anatomist Georges Cuvier. There's the biogeographer the Buffon, and several others. Lamarck, who proposes the first theory of evolution, and so on. But one of the things that Linnaeus does in the mid-1700s and is to set the foundations of modern taxonomy. And a curious thing that he does, following on Ray, he says that each species is bound together by reproduction. But he says the species stay constant apart from minor variations, and that no new species are produced. So this seems contrary to everything we believe in today, right? And everything, Darwin proposes theory of evolution, of the production, the appearance of new species. But Linnaeus is saying the opposite. He's saying no new species are produced. But it's a very important step, because at that point they believed that any two species could reproduce with each other and produce something else that was new and different. And that's how they believed that various sorts of monsters and chimeras and things like that were produced. Horses breeding with humans and wild animals with domestic animals and all sorts of unbelievable things. Linnaeus says this doesn't happen. Species are real units. No new species are produced, and they largely stay constant. And based on this, understanding that these things stay constant, he then sets up the system of classification. So this binomial nomenclature, the system of classification, is all dependent on the fact that things can't just change from one thing to another. The other really nice, interesting thing that Linnaeus does is points out the importance of ecological relationships and says that species play different roles in ecology. And so there are, predators and consumers and decomposers, and some animals are adapted to hot places and some to cool places and so on. And of course, since this is a very brief history lesson, I'm going to fast forward quite a bit. In about 100 years' time from then, from the early 800s onwards, geologists have started to establish that the Earth is actually like millions of years old. In fact, they've established that it's millions and millions, like this many, many millions of years old. And they found all of these strata, they found fossils in strata, they've recognized that fossils are extinct animals, and which one of the first people actually to recognize that was Leonardo da Vinci. But over time, the evidence for fossils being representative of animals that were no longer found on Earth has grown to a point where the scientific establishment of the time accepts it. What they didn't know was how these new species came about. And Lamarck had, of course, proposed that it was by this process, whereas he called it the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So as an animal changed its morphology to adapt to its environment, so it was like the classic example of a giraffe having to reach, further to reach its forage, that its offspring would inherit the longer neck that the parent had. So he called it the inheritance of acquired characteristics. But this, of course, we know today that knowing the large mechanisms of inheritance and genetics, that Lamarck transmission is for the most part not possible. There's some caveats to that, but I won't get into that here. But at the time, the large belief is that yes, new species do appear, but most people weren't happy with the explanation that Lamarck had given. And moreover, it's also interesting that scientific theories are often a product of what people believe in. Linnaeus, for example, perfectly correctly said that species don't change for the most part, but he didn't believe in the production of new species. Neither did Lamarck. Lamarck believed in the production of new species, but Lamarck didn't believe in extinction. He didn't believe that God would let animals go extinct, and so he came up with a theory of evolution to explain these changes over time. By the time Darwin gets interested, it's this emergence of new species is known as this mystery of mysteries, and all of the naturalists and geologists of the time are debating it. Darwin completes his voyage on the Beagle, comes up with the first draft of an essay on evolution by natural selection, after when he sees Malthus's essay on population growth, and then uses this idea of natural checks, comparing it with artificial selection, and says these natural checks have the same effects of the most skillful human selection, and he saw this as a powerful selective force. Simultaneously, Wallace, whose work in the Malay Archipelago is really quite seminal and quite is tremendous influence in the field of biogeography. He wrote to Darwin in 1858 and asked that with his short paper, and asked that it be forwarded to the famous geologist Charles Lyell. And Darwin said, Wallace had read my sketch written in 1842. He could not have made a better abstract. Lyell and other well-known naturalists of the time arranged for Darwin and Wallace's paper to be read together at the Linnean Society, so they would be co-credited with this idea of evolution by natural selection. So again, we're going to sort of fast forward from there. All of this sets the stage for our exploration of this field of evolutionary biology. The Mendelian rules of genetics were, of course, were discovered many years after he worked on it. And in the early 20th century, there was an evolutionary synthesis which combined Darwin's ideas of natural selection with an understanding of genetics to create an idea of evolution that incorporated both the mechanisms of evolution as well as the processes of evolution at a larger scale, right? The genetic mechanisms as well as the population level processes. Okay. So let's now ask what it is that we study in the field of evolution. We kind of look at it in two broad baskets. One is inferring the history of evolution, basically trying to understand the tree of life. And the other are the microevolutionary processes that occur at the genetic level that produce these changes, that underlie these changes that we see, right? So, and we're going to focus today largely on evolutionary history, but a large branch of evolutionary biology also focuses on these microevolutionary processes. And in fact, many evolutionary biologists will define evolution as changes in allele frequencies, allele being a copy of a particular gene that codes for a particular trait. And basically the changes in these allele frequencies over time is the process that occurs at the genetic level. What we see and the consequences are at the phenotypic level. The first part of this, as I said, is trying to understand evolutionary history. And this essentially is understanding how organisms are related to each other, which underlies the classification of organisms, right? When we classify organisms, we're essentially trying to put together organisms that are related to each other, and we understand these using evolutionary trees. So if some of this is obvious and some of it is not. So for example, if I look at a tree of reptiles, we find that actually there is no group that I can safely call reptiles. If I were to include crocodiles, tuataras, squamates, snakes, and lizards, as well as turtles, and those are traditionally the reptiles, right? So turtles, snakes, lizards, tuataras, and crocodiles. Now, if I were to call those reptiles, then what do I do with birds? Because birds are also part of that group. If I say, okay, you know what, I'm going to treat crocodiles separately, I'll just call tuataras, squamates, and turtles reptiles. That would be fine as well. On the other hand, I could also just say birds are flying reptiles and dispose of the class of birds. So when we read and interpret evolutionary trees, one of the things that we're trying to do, remember I used the word clade. A clade is an ancestor and all its descendants. An ancestor that includes all descendants over here, that includes turtles, squamates, tuataras, and crocodiles, must also include birds. Now, or another clade that I can see over here in this tree is birds, crocodiles, turtles, and squamates. There's actually in this group that there is no, there's the ancestor that includes all of them, as I said, is you either include all of them or you leave some of them out. Otherwise, it's not an evolutionary clade. So when we interpret these trees, we're trying to understand both who's most closely related to whom else, because they had a common origin. So essentially, when I'm reading this tree, my interpretation is that there was a common ancestor of birds and crocodilians that gave rise to these birds and crocodilians. That was related to something that was an ancestor of tuataras and squamates. And we can find many examples of this in cases where it might even surprise us. So for example, these are Old World and New World vultures. And for the longest time, people believed that New World and Old World vultures were related to each other. They are most closely related to birds of prey. Those are most closely related to storks. However, actually, in some of these cases, it's genetic data that has sort of provided the answer. Studies have found that Old World vultures are related to birds of prey. Storks are actually related, New World vultures are actually more closely related to storks. But this is weird, right? Like vultures just look so alike across the world. And This is due to a process that we call convergence, where unrelated organisms evolve traits, structural traits, and morphological features that have similar functions. And one of the most common of these is the fin, which you find in fish, of course, in reptiles, in birds, as well as in mammals. The other process that we talked about right at the outset is that of divergence, where you have a common ancestor, and due to some ecological, evolutionary, or biogeographic process, or a combination of them, these have actually diverged from each other. This is, of course, the classic example of Darwinian finches, but you could, the examples I gave you before of Hawaiian honey creepers, Caribbean anolis lizards, Madagascan vangers, these are all examples of divergence or diversification or adaptive radiation, which we also see in examples in India and the different regions, and I'll give you a couple of those examples as well. Okay, so I have been talking for a while. We're going to take a moment to do some things. Now, I have a set of pictures over here, and I'm going to tell you what these are. Number one is a shrew. Number two is a kangaroo. I hope that was obvious. Number three is an elephant shrew. Number four is a rock hyrax found in Africa. Number five is a sea cow. Number six is an elephant, in this case, an African elephant. And what I want you to do is draw an evolutionary tree of the sort that I showed you here, right? You can draw a tree that looks in shape like this, or you can draw one that looks like this. It doesn't matter that the two most closely connected lines represent the two most closely related animals, right? So let's take out a piece of paper and start drawing those trees of these mammals. Okay, so you got the number one is a shrew, two is a kangaroo, three is an elephant shrew, four is a rock hyrax, five is a sea cow, six is an African elephant. Okay, and what I'd like you to do is, as you complete your tree, just enter in the chat box which of these individuals you think is most distantly related to the others, and which pair or pairs are the most closely related. Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, guys, this is like a regular class, huh? So, like lecturer refused to go on until some people answer the question, and then you start calling out names. So please voluntarily put some answers in. Very good. I see some answers. Okay, I'm going to have to interpret now. Siddharth says, shrew and elephant, shrew, sea cow and elephant, most apart kangaroo and sea cow. Great, great. That's the kind of answer I want to hear. Utsav says 3 and 6. So that's elephant, shrew, and elephant. Most distant are hyrax and sea cow. Most close, sea cow and elephant. Great. 1 and 3 and 4 closely related. Abhishek says 2 and 6 distant. Most close 5 and 6. Okay, great. Some more. Elephant and hyrax closely related. Great. 1 and 3. Hey, this is a great class, man. Guys, have to work much harder usually. Very nice. I should have done a poll. Okay. Elephant shrew, elephant sea cow, shrew and tree, elephant shrew, beast kangaroo. So, all right, let's go and look at that. Let's go and look at the actual trees, shall we? Now, this is a particularly interesting example because till the early, well, some things here are obvious, right? And I'll tell you what's obvious to begin with. Let me just pull up the tree so that I can explain that. It's been known for a long time that kangaroos are marsupial mammals and mammals are composed of 3 large groups: the egg-laying mammals, the monotremes, that is the duck-billed platypus and echidna, the marsupials, which are these pouched mammals, which are found only in Australia and South America and Papua New Guinea and Papua. So very restricted in distribution. They emerged very early in the evolution of mammals. And all the other mammals are known as placental mammals. And so obviously the kangaroo is the odd one out here. It is probably equally distantly related to all of these, other placental mammals, give or take a little bit, a few million years here and there, but large. The kangaroo is like this little odd guy sitting out here. Of the others, actually, even though they're so different in size, for a long time, people have known that elephants and hyraxes are quite closely related to each other. And it's also been known that sea cows very likely evolved from ancestors of elephants, and so therefore sea cows and manatees, dugongs and manatees, are quite closely related to elephants as well. This particular tree shows dugongs and manatees and hyraxes being most closely related to each other, and then that group being related to elephants, which is fine. This we knew. Till the early 2000s, elephant shrews, elephant shrews, golden moles, and tenrecs were classified as classic shrews, which is a group called Insectivora. And people thought, because based both on morphology and other features, that actually these elephant shrews found in Africa were just like other shrews. And so for the longest time, they were classified as in the order Insectivora. But when the first genetic studies started coming out, people found that there was this group of very diverse mammals. So from elephants to manatees and hyraxes, of course, but also golden moles and elephant shrews that all evolved in Africa, and this group was subsequently known as Afrotheria. And so it turned out that these elephant shrews were actually related to elephants, who would have thought. So that's a good example of some things being pretty straightforward and obvious. And in most classification and most studying evolutionary relationships, we often find this combination of relationships that based on morphology alone tell you the full story. And in other cases, like with the vultures as well as with the elephant shrews, it throws up these surprises. And in the last 20 to 30 years, an increasing amount of genetic evidence and more recently genomic evidence is providing us finer and finer scaled understanding of the relationships between species, between genera, between orders, and between large classes of things. Okay. Before we move on, I want to do a slightly different kind of exercise. Now, the last exercise that we did was your guessing either on the basis of those photographs or on the basis of something that you've read somewhere and building a tree, right? Now, I am not interested in building the real tree. I actually want you to build trees that based on the hypotheses that I'm providing you. So, as we know, the humans and the apes include the non-human apes include gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. So there are two possible hypotheses, right, or scenarios for the evolutionary history of this group. One of those, and we can have many such hypotheses, but I'm just giving you two. One is that humans are most closely related to a group that comprises gorillas and chimps. And the other is that humans are most closely related to chimps, followed by gorillas. All right, so I want you to, again, take a couple of minutes to try and build these trees. So you can draw a tree that looks like this, except we have to just move everything around so that they reflect hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. All right. So I'm presuming that most of you have made some sort of attempt to draw these trees, and we'll take a look at some possibilities. So the question that I want to ask, keep in mind, is that and I'm going to put up a couple of trees, and I'm going to ask you guys to say which one you think is related to which one. Hypothesis 1 is that gorillas and chimps are most closely related to each other. Hypothesis 2 is that humans and chimps are most closely related to each other, right? So does 3A correspond to hypothesis 1 or 2? And remember, we're not arguing about which is the correct tree over here. We just want to know which tree corresponds to which hypothesis. I see the number if you say 1. And what about hypothesis 2? Is that 3B or 3C? 3B or 3C? So hypothesis 2, yeah, okay. I see a flurry of B's over there. That's great. No dissent, no disagreement. All right. So that is in fact correct, and perhaps too straightforward. But what we're trying to do essentially over here is we can have multiple hypotheses, we can represent these hypotheses of these relationships as trees, and therefore, because a particular hypothesis corresponds to a particular tree, the tree that we derive getting either using morphological data or genetic data or genomic data, or whatever it is, then can be used as support for that particular hypothesis. So for example, when we look at an actual tree of apes, we find that the two species of chimpanzees, bonobos and chimps, are the most closely related to each other. They're most closely related to humans, which in turn, this entire group is most closely related to gorillas and those to orangutans and so on. And this is the process that we use to go from to construct evolutionary relationships, to hypothesize relationships between different taxa, and this could be at a large scale in terms of looking at that relationship between mammals and birds and reptiles, at a lower scale looking at all the orders within mammals, or at an even lower scale looking at all of the species across different genera in amongst apes. And of course, we could take this one step finer and look at the relatedness between individual species of a particular genus found in a particular region. And that's another step that we'll come to a little bit later. Okay. All right. So let me briefly talk about the history of the Earth, and then we'll take a break. Now, as we know today, the continents have shifted over a period of time, and what's represented over here is the different periods such as the Upper Carboniferous, Eocene, Lower Quaternary, and so on. Now, the idea of plate tectonics was proposed by Alfred Wegener, but this was and also an interesting historical aside is that Wegener proposed this in the early 1900s, but a lot of scientists didn't accept his theory. And two of the main reasons that his theory was kind of like was not accepted in the mainstream. One was that geologists of the time did not think there was a mechanism, right? They were not aware of a mechanism, and they were like, but there's no mechanism for this, right? And so they could not conceptualize a way in which plate tectonics could occur. The second, of course, was a little bit more was something else that we also come across in Science and Society, which is that Wegener himself was not a geologist; he was trained as a meteorologist, and so there was a little bit of, I guess, the geologist saying, "Usko kya pata" types. So Wegener proposed this idea of plate tectonics as this complex interaction of the Earth's crust, mantle, and core. That essentially these continents consisted of plates that were roughly 100 kilometers thick, and there was a thin, rigid layer of crust which adhered to the upper layer of the mantle. And he proposed these three forces, which I won't go into very much detail over here, but these forces that he called ridge push, mantle drag, and slab pull. So there was the push that was coming from the forces of from the heat from the Earth's core and the molten the lava, and this was actually pushing the continent. So this was a physical, like a push, emanating from the Earth's from the heat of the core. But then there were also the continents being sort of dragged across this crust a little bit like the luggage on a conveyor belt, right? So there were these multiple sort of forces that were acting on the movement of these continents. Now, the continents that we know, and less is known about the Earth's history prior to that, but there would have been tectonic movement in those times as well, are Pangaea, Gondwana, and Laurasia, and I will sort of give those, I'll show you that in a graphic in a minute. Pangaea was a supercontinent that broke up into Gondwana and Laurasia that had significant influence on the distribution of animals as we know it today. Now, a lot of the evidence for the existence of for plate tectonics, for continental drift, and the shape of these continents kind of came from multiple different sources, from ice movement, but also from the distribution of different. Sorry, I had my video off for a while. I apologize. Also from the distribution of current and extinct plants and animals. So, for example, Caribbean beetles that are found in these parts of Australia and New Zealand and Southern America. Proteaceae, which is which has this distribution of South America and Africa, where those continents also sort of like geometrically fit together. Piped frogs, as well as these extinct plants called Glossopteris, which were found throughout Gondwana and are shown in this graphic right on top, which sort of shows the perfect fit of those continents during the at about 200 odd million years ago. There are Glossopteris fossils in India as well. The history of India itself, though, is the history of its breakup from Gondwana land, which comprised all of these continents that were, as I said, together about 200 million years ago. And about 160 million years ago starts to break up. India starts to break up with Africa and Madagascar, India and Madagascar start to drift from Antarctica and Australia about 130 million years ago, and by about 100 million years ago, India is sort of like beginning to drift northwards. And one of the things about this period of India's history is actually very little. Is in the mainstream evolutionary biology and life science courses and ecology, we learned very little paleontology. But there's actually quite a rich paleontological deposits in India. There's rich fossil deposits in the entire Narmada belt, going up from Madhya Pradesh to Gujarat, where you have these incredible dinosaur fossils, dinosaur eggs and so on. And a couple of the best known dinosaurs described from India. One is Barapasaurus, which is like Barapa, Bigfoot. And then there's a predator called Rajasaurus that was described about 20 years ago. But apart from the dinosaur fauna, there's actually quite a rich history of fauna that's been described from the subcontinent. And one of the most remarkable stories there is, as you can see over here, about 100 million years ago, India starts to drift northwards, breaks away completely from Gondwana, and somewhere around 50 million years ago joins with the Asian subcontinent. I'm just going to play that again. You see the original breakup of Gondwana and the northern rift of India as an island. And so many people have talked about India as an arc, bringing all of these African and Gondwana, some Gondwanan, many African faunas that then dispersed into Asia. One of the someone's going to have to mute that gentleman. One of the interesting paleontological stories from this period, or evolutionary stories from this period, is that as India approached the Asian continent, the Tethys Sea that was the sea between India and the sea in the northern Indian Ocean became narrower and narrower and eventually got squeezed out. And as it became shallower, it became this really rich, resource-rich area that mammals started to sort of exploit. And one of those groups of mammals that are related to pigs and hippos that went into the water became the ancestor of all whales and dolphins, of all cetaceans. So the ancestors of all whales and dolphins in the world actually come from the Indian subcontinent and evolved in the Tethys Sea as it narrowed, it became shallower. And so those ancestral, the fossils of those ancestors are actually found in parts of northern India and Pakistan and so on. So just a very, very brief history of not of the Earth, so sort of from Precambrian times, when the first multicellular organisms evolved. And there was this great diversification event in the Cambrian, and followed by other periods of the Paleozoic, where the earliest fishes evolved. The fauna is dominated by trilobites and brachiopods, to the Devonian, which is marked by the vertebrate invasion of land, and the latter part of the Paleozoic, where the first reptiles and mammal-like reptiles evolved. The Mesozoic, we kind of think of as the age of the dinosaurs, but also the earliest mammals evolved, as well as the birds. And by the end of the Cretaceous at the K3 boundary, of course, there's the mass extinction. There's the one more mass extinction event, that of dinosaurs. There's also a massive Permian extinction event where most plants and animals across the world completely go extinct. And so there's been these diversification events that have appeared in spurts, and these mass extinction events. One of the things to remember is that there is dispute about whether these were sudden or not, because what looks sudden on the evolutionary timescale may have happened over hundreds of thousands or even a million plus years, which really is a long period of time. Sorry, and of course there's the Cenozoic, where a lot of the fauna that we see in India today, especially mammals, a lot of those evolved in the Paleocene and Eocene, and even in the Miocene, which is all in that period between 60 and 30 million years, and afterwards as well. So a lot of the diversification, some of the diversification that I'll talk about, happens in the last, let's say, that 50 to 60 million years, million year period. There's also other interesting geographical events. The one that we who are interested in Indian fauna are obsessed with, Indian flora and fauna, are this separation from Gondwana the drifting of the continent and its collision with Eurasia. But there's also other global events, like when the Isthmus of Panama forms and closes, and therefore separates the Indian Ocean and the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans about 3 to 5 million years ago, and then the formation of the Red Sea and all of these other geological events that have fairly profound consequences on on the diversification and extinction, both speciation and extinction of flora and fauna. All right, let me see where we are. Okay, thanks for those in the chat that are answering other questions. It's now 3 o'clock. Let's take let's take time for questions. Maybe a few minutes for questions now, as we go into another sort of like part of the session, and after that we'll take a short break as well. We'll take a short coffee break. So if any of you have questions about what we've talked about so far, go ahead and shoot. Yeah, the land masses are still moving, and there continues to be different land masses move at different paces. Some are moving really slowly, some are moving faster, but they're all moving at geological timescales, right? So they certainly wouldn't appear to be, but they are. And these plate movements and these rifts are, in fact, some of these are what, in fact, a lot of most all earthquakes perhaps are caused by, maybe not all, sorry, my geology is really poor, but many of the earthquakes are formed by these movements at these plate boundaries. What's the best preservation method for fossils? Actually, they're already preserved, but that's not a question for me. Google probably has a better answer than that. I think most fossils, things that have been properly fossilized, have been preserved in that form for millions of years. I think for the best part, it's just ensuring that they don't get, broken, or there's they're in places where there's a lot of pollution and so on. They can be they can lose some of their properties or fall apart or whatever. But I think just keeping them in a once they've been sort of removed from whatever substrate or rock they were in, then I just think keeping them protected from the elements is probably sufficient. I mean, we've seen displays of fossil animals in natural history museums around the world. So I wonder if, I'm not sure if they necessarily treat them to protect them or not. You can also, that's a really good question. You can also put your mic on and ask the question directly if you'd like, I think. Can they do that, Sophia?
I don't see why not.
No, they have access to the audio. So yeah, you're welcome to do that or type messages. And what's the best example you would give to someone who doesn't believe in evolution? So there's a micro and a macro answer to that, in the sense that that there are examples of, there's some classic examples of, this of the industrial melanism from the UK in these moths, that they found that in areas where in industrial areas where the substrates they were on, like the trees and so on, were like they were soot covered and darker, these moths had actually like become darker in those areas. This classic sort of textbook example of showing that that species can adapt very rapidly to change. But we have relatively few examples of that, except from the lab, where you can, in a few generations, or even in artificial selection of plants and animals, you can show that things can change in feature dramatically in a short period of time, right? And so you can show that. Now, that's different perhaps from saying, so in the sense that to me, it's only a small leap to say that I can breed, an animal, a plant in a few generations, I can breed an animal in a few generations. If things can change over time that rapidly, then given thousands of years, surely things can change as well. It's not proof of itself in itself, right? To me, that comes from inferring from actually looking at a combination of factors, right? Why are animals that are closely related to each other, why do they look alike? Why are certain animals extinct? What do fossils represent? So if you actually look at this from the perspective of, if you really want to convince somebody who doesn't believe, then what does the geological record represent, right? Why are the geological strata in a particular order that if you use physical science methods to date, you can date them to particular periods in time. Now, systematically across the world, you get the same fauna at those periods of time. What's your alternate explanation for that? That somebody went around, like whatever, some power that went around planting these things around to fool modern scientists. I think there's evolution occurred only once, right? And it's occurred over a period of time that we can't do experiments or measurements on it in the same way that we do on genetics or chemical reactions. On the other hand, the universe also evolved only once, and whatever inferences we make about the origin of the universe are very similar to the inferences we make about evolution. It occurred once, and we see certain signals that these are the best explanations that we have for today. I'm not talking today, giving a talk about how we make scientific inferences, but the combination of the observations that we make, we have a set of best explanations for, and those best explanations have the least contradictions, right? I would say that is you do need to appeal to the nature of scientific inference to convince someone that evolution occurred. If they don't, then they'll always find counter arguments for it. Okay, there's a lot of are aquatic and terrestrial mammals closely related? Absolutely. In fact, different aquatic mammals are related to different terrestrial mammals. So in the example that you saw, dugongs and manatees, which are sea cows, are most closely related to elephants. Cetaceans, that's whales and dolphins, are most closely related to pigs and hippos, that is to even-toed ungulates. Seals, sea lions, and walruses are most closely related to other carnivores, such as tigers and lions and dogs and so on. And sea otters are most closely related to otters. So actually, like, you have different aquatic animals. So the aquatic habit evolved multiple times within mammalian groups. Almost all mammalian groups, except maybe bats and stuff. Most mammalian groups have an aquatic representative. There's aquatic rodents. There's an aquatic, all sorts of things. Is it for the intrinsic value of humans, or is it for nature, since we recognize these? Are you asking, Ria, what it should be? Because in practice, it's both. No? There are some people arguing for the intrinsic value of nature and other people arguing that it's for human. Now, there's a long philosophical debate about this, and I'm not going to get into that over here. But in theory, in practice, both are possible. In theory, both are possible. In practice, both happens. There's a number of people who believe that we should conserve. There's some people who believe that animals should be protected because all animals have, every animal life has a right. Today, I'm not going to talk about the pros and cons or my views on these subjects. But certainly at one end of the spectrum, people believe in animal rights. At another level, people believe that may not believe in individual animal rights, but they believe that biodiversity should exist for for the intrinsic value of nature, independent of humans. And other people believe that we should conserve nature for its ecosystem services. And there are also people who believe that the intrinsic value of nature that humans believe in is in fact one of the ecosystem services. So all of that is out there. Yeah, this is Suparna says mammals are the most advanced animals in the animal kingdom. Then why do they go to the aquatic life chain? I think it's a misconception that things project in a linear fashion. Many animals came to land. So why we'll talk about this a little bit later. Why do individual animals do what they do? I perhaps didn't spend enough time on the idea of selection. A large part of our emphasis today and the evidence is in favor of individual selection. Individuals are selected, not species, not groups. Individuals are selected because they leave behind more offspring, right? And individuals leave behind more offspring by either being better at competition, not being eaten by predators, or being faster, or hiding better, or producing more eggs, getting more mates. So the combination of processes that would be either natural selection or sexual selection, some individuals leave more offspring than others. Now, some can leave more offspring behind by actually becoming, in that chain of development of organs can leave things out, right? So because the cost outweighs the benefit. So organisms that live in caves and have lost their eyesight or have very vestigial senses of vision are actually more recent than the animals that they evolved from that did have eyes. But eyes are costly to produce and it was useless to them because it was dark, right? And so they actually were able to invest their energy in other things that help them leave more offspring behind. And so they lost their eyes, or they lost vision, right? And so you can have this idea that once they came on land, why are they going back to water? The ones that went back to water were obviously doing better in water than some of their relatives on land, or other individuals on land, gaining more resources, leaving behind more offspring, right? So animals will do what plants and animals will do what gets them the most benefit. I say it in a slightly anthropomorphic way, but essentially as measured by the fact that they leave behind more offspring, they leave behind more copies of those genes, and therefore those then become more widespread over time. And as I said at the beginning, that can be briefly sort of concisely stated as the change in the allele frequency over time, right? I think yeah. Is there a chance that a tectonic plates merge together to form a single landmass like earlier? I suppose given hundreds of millions of years, possibly, because I think that during the period from the origin of the Earth, it's likely that there have been multiple supercontinents and they've broken apart. We know less about that earlier period in history. But yeah, I suppose geologists would be able to model whether this would or could happen again. I just I just don't know the answer to that. I suppose in theory it's possible. So, change in heritable traits. Pretty much. I mean, change in heritable traits as change in, if you mean again changes in allele frequencies, I think we're saying the same. I think we're saying the same thing over there. What are the alternate theories explaining evolution apart from Darwinian theory of natural selection? There's the creationist or the intelligent design theory, which is sort of the most significant in opposition, which most well, let me rephrase that, which is the bedrock of most religions, right? Other than more recently, there's been debates about, there's also directed theories of evolution that it's, so natural selection is fairly neutral with regard to the directionality of evolution. Some people believe that there are, just to put it fairly coarsely, that there are forces that direct evolution in certain directions. There's the Lamarckian theory, and the reason that we don't believe that Lamarckian evolution is possible is that Lamarck's theory supposes that changes that happen to somatic cells in the body, so basically like you go to the gym and work out and your body changes, like those changes of somatic cells can then reflect in the next generation. But we know that doesn't happen because the somatic cells aren't involved in reproduction, right? And so the reproduction happens through the genes that we already have that are in the reproductive cells, like in the sperm and the ova. And so for the large part, when the mechanisms of genetics and also the central dogma of the DNA produces RNA produces protein, which is essentially saying that you can produce protein from DNA. But what happens when something changes in, when you put on muscle or fat, is your changes in your structure, so that you can't now reverse engineer a change in proteins to DNA, right? And that's the sort of the contradiction of how genetics works, of how heredity works, to how Lamarckian evolution might occur. But there is there are more recent, there's work that suggests not exactly Lamarckian evolution in that traditional form that he proposed it, but Lamarckian elements to it. So well, the Indian plate's long movement and path, the path is actually highly disputed. What I showed you was just one sort of like version of it. The path, some people, based again on the relationships of certain faunas and have proposed that actually the Indian plate moved much closer to Africa, and there was even contact at one point of time. Another one proposes that it was much closer to Southeast Asia. So the exact path is actually quite disputed. Any other questions that I've missed? What are some of the current topics of study in evolution? Maybe we'll come to that at the end. A question from YouTube. If we say we evolved from one era, this is actually an interest. It's a question is, again, I just want to go back to the earlier point that when 2 points actually. One is that when one life form diverges, and we'll talk about how things diverge from each other, and this will be important. it doesn't mean that others, that is outcompeting everything else, right? There's also, when you look across, across a swath, like you've said, Monera to protists to plants and animals, different organisms are playing different roles. And you're competing with things that occupy a similar role. You're not competing necessarily with things that occupy different roles. So I think we should take that break. But I wanted to maybe just make one quote like that's interesting over here. A very famous evolutionary biology, Dobzhansky, very well known for this quote where he says, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, which is, of course, we're like, oh, that's true. Like you can't understand biology without understanding evolution. That's a fair point. But two ecologists in the 70s or 80s also said nothing in evolution makes sense except in the light of ecology. Yes. So if you want to understand why different forms evolved, why different forms exist, then we need to think in terms of the ecology of interactions between those organisms.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Can I?
Sure.
When we consider evolution, there is considered a major point when the aquatic animals started moving towards the land and originated the amphibians. But why don't we consider when insects dominated the earth and they are better in fertility and survivability and in comparison to everything than the other vertebrates? Why are not they considered as the major event?
Oh, I'm sorry if I didn't mention it. It is considered a major event. Insects are the most populous organisms, both in terms of species diversity. There's groups that have phenomenally high biomass. Yeah, it's true that honestly a lot of emphasis both on current fauna and extant fauna is on vertebrates, but insects, invertebrates as a whole. And remember that invertebrates comprise many different phyla, right? I don't know how many even now they have. And all of these vertebrates that we talk about today are a single phylum. Now, so the amount of attention that it kind of there is a sort of what we call a taxonomic chauvinism. So we talk about plants, but plants are actually like all, if you take even just angiosperm plants, it's like this hugely diverse group. And then we say invertebrates, right? So many different phyla. And of course, the single phylum vertebrates get the most attention. Within vertebrates, probably mammals and birds get the most attention. So that way there is an emphasis deriving from what people have studied, what they've been interested in terms of paleofauna, what fossils people have been able to find, and so on. So those biases do exist, but I don't dispute your point that the invasion of land by invertebrates actually is also an extremely significant by plants and invertebrates is a very significant evolutionary event, far preceding the invasion by different by the vertebrates and so on. But I have to look to see which when exactly these different colonizations of land occurred by different invertebrate groups. I don't exactly remember, but the invasion of land by vertebrates also occurs pretty early. It's about, so I'll have to check exactly chronologically how they match up.
Yes, thank you.
All right. We can send out a list of books later. We'll we'll maybe talk a little bit about this, about the climate change and stuff like that at the end. Yeah, I see a question about that. Okay. Abhishek, one last question before we take a break.
Hello, sir. I have one question. In the beginning, you showed a map representing various biodiversity hotspot, and that occurred in the tropics mostly. And even in the tropics, there are only few regions which are biodiversity hotspots. So we saw that few organisms, they diversified intensively, but there were also some organisms from some groups which didn't evolve much in the same habitat. So is there any genetic factor which drives higher rate of evolution in some organisms and not in some organisms in that same habitat?
Right. So we'll one part of the question is a sort of spatial question. Why do some areas have more species than others? And I'd like to wait till we do part 2 of this. But the other part of the question is more is why do some clades diversify more than others? The explanations that people have given have related to either ecological opportunity or evolutionary innovation. And what they mean by this is that ecological opportunity is sometimes like being accidentally, either by changes in climate or being transported to areas where a whole bunch of niches were available, and they're diversifying to occupy those niches. So it's a bit like those birds, the ancestor of the finches going out to the Galapagos and then like going to different islands and being able to occupy, diversifying into different sort of niches over there. Or evolutionary innovations, which are considered to be things like wings that allow you to actually, again, the innovation allows you to access different resources or habitats, which then allows you to diversify rapidly, right? So yes, genetic obviously, but not something that the mechanisms are at the genetic scale, but the processes in a sense are, either in an environmental ecological context or in an environmental ecological context, which could be both biotic and abiotic. Yeah, we'll come back to the spatial element of it in part 2. I'm going to stop taking questions here for a minute and take a break because I definitely need a cup of coffee. I'll be back in 5 minutes. We'll start again at 3:35 and we'll go through part 2 of this. Okay, let's get started again.
हमारा लग गया है वहां पर। उधर देखो सामने वो लोग गए नहीं है, वो इधर ही घूम रहे हैं, कार लेके खड़े ना बाहर।
Muted.
आज मैं आर्यन और आशु के लैब था। ये चीज बोलने की नहीं होती है सर, पता चलता है कि नहीं ये सब फिल्टर पानी है, ये जो वाटर कैन आते हैं ना वो वाला पानी। सर आपको लग रहा है कि
Can you folks mute? Or can you mute whoever it is has the mic on?
यही होता है पेपर का मतलब। देखो कि मैं थोड़ा सा कैसे दे दूं कहां से यहाँ तो हमें तो कितना निकालना है ना। तो क्या हम
Ashish, can you mute yourself?
हाँ बना ठीक है, ये फिट था बनाते हैं वीडियो बनाएंगे तो डाल देंगे। हाँ सुबह से इधर ही है सर, कुछ नहीं आपको कुछ बताओ।
Do we have? Yeah. Anyway, let's start. Distracting. Ashish, can you mute yourself, please?
देख लिया आपकी शुरुआत अभी तो डेटा परचेज करना आपको पैसा ही लगता है। नहीं अब डेटा सबसे बड़ा है इधर देखियो। अचानक से बड़ा
Are we able
Yes.
to? Are we able to remove?
We're not. I tried, but we don't have the permission. I think the CES IAC, that particular profile has to.
I see present over here. Is it who's managing CSISC?
I think Vishu is. Let me just text in the group and find out.
Yeah. Okay.
व्हाइट बोर्ड चाहिए आपको? पढ़ाएंगे, हमारे को पढ़ाएंगे क्या आप खुद ही खुद को पढ़ाएंगे?
Ashish?
तो सर आप खुद ही खुद को पढ़ाएंगे तो हमको हम सामने बैठ जाएंगे। क्या बनाने वाले हो?
Yeah, we know, but neither of us is the admin Priya, unfortunately. Okay, I'm just going to try and talk over Mr. Ashish. So we talked so far about evolutionary patterns, the history of the Earth, and as I said at the beginning, one of the things that sort of really defines the distribution and diversity of life on Earth is the combination of things that evolve and things that disperse. Okay, so if you think about it one way, that where we find a species today or where we find it historically is a combination of either it started out there, right? It evolved there. So as I am here today in this room, you're in your room, maybe because you were there all your life, or I was here forever, right? Either that or I arrived there from somewhere, right? A process in evolutionary terms or ecological terms that we know as dispersal, but dispersal in evolutionary terms is a bit different from this, or the influence it has is different from the effect of ecological dispersal. Now, over thousands of years, plants and animals do move about, and they arrive in certain places and interact with other organisms that got over there or were born there. Now, at those places, the combination of abiotic factors, that they encounter results in their either staying alive or not. And similarly, the interactions with competitors, with predators, and so on, and the biotic food resources, again ensures whether they stay alive or not. So whether you originated at a place or arrived there, these abiotic and abiotic factors ensure whether you continue to be found there or not, and for whatever period of time. So if you look at extent, we just look at the extent distribution of plants and of animals, we can say that the three processes of dispersal, origin, and survival determine whether a species is found in a particular location or not. And in a sense, if we now just overlay these species ranges on each other, we get these patterns of species diversity that we saw at the beginning, that is of lots of species being found in the tropics, fewer in temperate regions, and so on. So these primary processes driving biogeography are dispersal and diversification. And dispersal itself can take multiple forms, but to broadly categorize them, dispersal takes place as sort of a gradual range expansion. So over a period of time, animals expand their range because they're successful, and and so they occupy new areas adjacent to their own, to their existing areas. Animals also colonize areas by jump dispersal. So a lot of the oceanic islands, and even from one continent to another, often they move these large distances either passively because they're carried by wind or water, because they are able to move those larger distances. And obviously, there's a whole combination of factors that determines whether animals are able to move or not. Now, dispersal, as I said, it's all about dispersal and diversification. Dispersal is one process, diversification is the other, which is, so an area has organisms because there was a lot of dispersal into it, or a lot of organisms diversified over there. And the classic cases of what are called adaptive radiation are finches, the honey creepers, all of those, which adaptive radiation implies adaptation, right? And in a sense that comes with morphological differentiation. But there's also many instances of what are known as non-adaptive radiations, where there is not necessarily a morphological change in response to an ecological environment. Nevertheless, there is an underlying divergence between the species. Now, before we look at that more closely, I just wanted to go back to this idea of trees and use trees to try and understand the biogeographic relationship between organisms, right? And because up to this point, we said the two things that are on a tree close together are species that are closely related to each other, which had a common ancestor. Now, in a tree, the species that the node that combines to the ancestral node for two species is what those two evolved, are hypothesized to have evolved from. Now, in studying area, we will argue that when we find that two species closely related also came from the same area, that in fact their ancestor may have been from that area as well, or an area close to it, right? So supposing I take an example of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are spread here. If you can see my cursor, that's the Andaman, that's Little Andaman, and goes all the way down to Great Nicobar. And Myanmar is somewhere up here, okay? And Sumatra is somewhere down here. In fact, the southern tip of Great Nicobar is only 140 kilometers from Sumatra. So you can have two hypotheses. Let's say that I'm hypothesizing about some lizards that I found over there, some geckos. And I have a hypothesis that these lizards colonized the Andamans and went down this way, Little Andamans, Car Nicobar, blah, 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 and found their way down there. And there's another biogeographer who says, no, that's not what happened. I think that the ones that you get in the, that these guys all, diversified in Southeast Asia and moved around. And some of them arrived at Andamans from Myanmar, and some arrived at Nicobar from Sumatra. In reality, we see, well, one scenario more often, but both are possible. Now, what I want you to do is go back to your pencil and paper and spend 2 minutes drawing similar trees, one which reflects hypothesis 1 and the other one which reflects hypothesis 2. Let's just spend a couple of minutes doing that, and I'll show you what that looks like. All right. I hope you've all taken a stab at that. I just want to show you the, how we might infer from these. And as you would have seen in the case of the trees where we're trying to infer relatedness between taxa, if I looked at this species or closely related species of geckos from these regions, and I found that in my tree, the closest relatives within this gecko group are always the ones in the Andamans and Myanmar and the ones in Sumatra and Nicobar. I can also infer from these that, and both of those groups as a whole are sort of related to the larger Southeast Asian geckos. I can infer that the Andaman geckos the closest relatives being from Myanmar dispersed into the Andamans from Myanmar. Similarly, that the Nicobar geckos, their closest relatives being from Sumatra, arrived there from Sumatra. Alternately, if I were to see the tree on my right, where Andaman and Nicobar most closely related to each other, and those are related to Myanmar, then that entire Andaman Nicobar group has been derived from the Myanmar group, and Andaman and Nicobar Andamans being closer to Myanmar, I would hypothesize that they've left Myanmar, arrived at the Andamans, and then worked their way down to Nicobar, right? There's some few caveats here, especially when we're inferring, about taxa, the relatedness of taxa to each other, as well as about making biogeographic inference from these trees. It does depend to a great extent on sampling. So, for example, I could say that, oh, you know what, I just missed out sampling the Central Nicobar group, and what actually happens is that the species arrived in Central Nicobar from I don't know, let's say Thailand, and from southern Thailand, and this is a bit of a stretch, but I'm just making this up to give an example. And from Central Nicobar came into Nicobar, and I never put either Central Nicobar or Thailand samples in my tree, and so Nicobar showed up as being closely related to Sumatra, but it actually isn't that closely related to Sumatra either. So a lot of the inferences that we make from these trees do depend on the extent and the appropriateness of the sampling that we do. That's something that I'd like to really emphasize, because a lot of poor inferences have been arrived at by not having a thorough enough sampling of taxa across their entire range. And when I say taxa across the range, it depends on the resolution that you're looking at. If you're looking at a family, then you want a sampling of the family from wherever it is found, of the genus, then of that genus from wherever it is found, and for species and so on. Now, one other point that I wanted to make, one other example that I wanted to make is there's a really interesting paper from the early 2000s separating African elephants into two species. And initially their hypothesis was that forest elephants were separate from savanna elephants. And what they've subsequently found, of course, is that forest elephants from Western Africa, from a particular region, are actually quite dramatically different from elephants found everywhere else. But it was not really forest versus savanna, and that inference only came about because they had not sampled forest elephants everywhere, right? So that lack of sampling led to this artifact where you thought that the underlying factor was the fact that one occupied forest and one occupied savanna, but it was actually elephants from a particular part of Africa, but in that region they all happen to be forest elephants. So, having told some general stories, I thought I would, bring this around to a group that, to an area that at least, many of you may have had an opportunity to visit or may have an opportunity to visit in the near future. That of the Western Ghats, where a lot of the work that my group, as well as others in the department, and many other biogeographers in the country have worked in. One of the questions that we ask about peninsular India in general is about routes of dispersal from, Gondwana to India, and from India out of India, and so on. So there were many hypotheses about the out of India radiation from the out of India dispersals after India joins with the Asian subcontinent, and the into India dispersals as well. And so, for example, from my colleagues' paper, here's a couple of trees that represent what we were doing in that earlier biogeographic tree with Myanmar and the Andaman Nicobar Islands, which is the tree that would represent a Gondwanan origin, and an out of in India origin is represented above, where the fauna here, the Indian and South Asian fauna is most closely related to Madagascar, and that whole clade is related to Africa and South America. There's a typical, like, following the breakup of Gondwana kind of thing, where you can see that the Indian and South Asian faunas are derived from the Indian and Madagascan faunas. And below you have an out of Asia and post-collision, dispersal into India, where you have this breakup of Africa with India, and most of the dispersal in India, most of the dispersal and diversification happens post-collision of India with the Asian continent. So we make these inferences based on the topology or the shapes of these trees. We make similar and more focused inferences on the Western Ghats, where we also talk about routes of dispersal. If species moved from the Western Ghats into Asia, or moved into the Western Ghats from Southeast Asia, did they come via the Eastern Ghats? Did they come via the Vindhya Satpura hill range? And there's some hypothesis of dispersals through the Aravalli range as well. Over a period of many years, and the work of several students and colleagues, some really interesting patterns emerged, and I want to highlight some of those here. One of the most remarkable patterns that emerges from the Palghat Gap, from the Western Ghats, is this deep time influence of this Palghat Gap, right? And the Palghat Gap is this valley in the southern Western Ghats that goes down almost to sea level, is the deepest sort of gap in the Ghats. And repeatedly across many different animals, you find that the Palghat Gap has sort of served as this barrier over millions of years. So for example, with the bush frogs or Rochesters, you find a southern clade that's predominantly found in the southern Ghats. A few of those species have sort of migrated north, but this is largely a southern clade. And then you find a northern clade, which is sort of predominantly remained in the northern Ghats. You also find signatures of habitat. So you get many more open canopy species in the north. So 60% of the species in the north are open canopy, whereas nearly 80% of the species in the south are closed canopy. You also get upper canopy level species in the south, which you don't get in the north. And this is very interesting. One of the interesting aspects of the discovery of some of these patterns, as well as for other lizards, is that some of these open canopy species that evolved and show adaptations to open canopy habitats, such as grasslands, actually aligned with the time that grasslands as a biome was spreading across the world. So we're also inferring that grasslands probably arrived in India 15 to 20 million years ago when they were spreading across the world, and we can see evidence of that also in certain lizards and as well as these frogs. You see the similar north-south, northern clade, southern clade pattern in these Nyctibatrachus frogs as well. You see them again in these agamid lizards, and then you see them in these snakes such as pit vipers and vine snakes. In pit vipers, vine snakes, and agamid, in these lizards, you also see this. You see an additional pattern. The groups that you see over here that are in green are actually a separate radiation. They're like they're a Southeast Asian radiation whose members are also occupying parts of peninsular India, all of peninsular India and the Ghats. But the blue one is sort of a in situ radiation. This is a group of lizards that you find only here that have diversified here. So what we're seeing here is a bit of a khichdi. You're seeing lizards that diversified here, as well as guys that came in from elsewhere. So you see the effects of diversification and dispersal. You see the same thing again for pit vipers and vine snakes. You see a diversification that occurred over here. In this case, those are shaded in blue. And they're very similar to those frogs, you see the effect of the Palghat Gap, you see different species to the north and south of the Palghat Gap. And then, of course, you see representatives from the Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian radiation, which are also found in these areas. And so you see this like combination of species that dispersed here and species that just diversified here. The Palghat Gap itself is quite interesting because, you think, okay, yeah, like these guys have been around there for 15 million years. Yeah, surely they have separated from each other and they're like little frogs and maybe they never found their way across the gap, But as I mentioned a moment ago, that we find snake species separated from each other based on these the Palghat Gap and another gap for the south called the Shenkota Gap. You also find this effect on birds. So small ground-dwelling birds like these birds that are called Sholakhilis, that are the work of my colleague Robin. And you also find them in larger animals like elephants. You, of course, find these differences at different scales than you would find these differences in say, frogs in different taxonomic scales. But nevertheless, the fact that at the level of both biogeography and phylogeography, these features have this really dramatic effect on or influence on these patterns that we're seeing is something that then becomes critical for our understanding of what we're seeing, right? So that sort of brings me to the end of understanding patterns. And there's a very nice segue into understanding processes. And in understanding processes, we've talked again about we've talked about diversification and dispersal, and those are really, we're just going to see the things that underlie these processes of diversification and dispersal. Diversification, of course, comprises speciation and extinction. And as I said, our discussion about the frogs and the Sholakhilis and elephants was a really good segue into this, because one of the major mechanisms of speciation across probably most groups of vertebrates is what's known as allopatric speciation. And as you can see from this figure over here, allopatric speciation is when two populations are geographically separated by a barrier. Sympatric is when the two species are not separated by a barrier. And parapatric is when they are separated not by a physical barrier, but an environmental gradient, such as the temperature gradient along the top and top to the bottom of a mountain. The most widespread of these, allopatric speciation, can occur in two ways. One, it can occur when you have a large population. A barrier forms separating the existing population into two, and those eventually then diverge and become separate, species. This can also occur through what is called a founder event, when an animal disperses across an existing barrier and forms another founder population, and that eventually evolves into a new species. So these two things are known as dispersal and vicariance. And vicariance events, can be through geological or environmental change, rising sea levels, which sort of separate connected land masses from each other, mainlands from islands, islands from each other, and so on. Vicariant events can come about by continental drift, by mountains moving apart. They can be by mountains forming, separating populations from each other. They can be from valleys forming in mountains like the Palghat Gap, and so on. And the dispersal of founder events usually involve this movement of individuals across a barrier, and usually involve a small initial population. Once populations re-establish contact, they may not interbreed or produce fertile offspring, in which case they remain separate from each other. They may interbreed freely and extensively, which may eventually, those populations may become, by exchanging genes, may, no longer be considered separate from each other. They may hybridize, but hybrids may be less fit and not survive, and therefore that might maintain reproductive isolation to different degrees. the examples that I gave you from the Western Ghats, for example, of the frogs, many of the frogs that were isolated on mountaintops may have been separated from each other by these gaps. But because they were found in similar environments, they may not have needed to become morphologically very different from each other. And that's one example of non-adaptive radiation of many frogs in the Western Ghats that have become distinct. So it's also called, it's not adaptive radiations, but it's geographic radiations, because geographic features such as barriers separate populations that diverge, leading to the radiation or the diversification of many species. But the environmental factors driving morphological change were not there. Sympatric speciation, as I said, occurs, I won't dwell too much on this, but it occurs when species are not geographically separated from each other. It can come about by a number of processes such as disruptive selection, chromosomal changes of various sorts. And some of the examples are of, many of these examples are from fish, cichlids in Africa, sticklebacks in British Columbia, and so on. The flip side of speciation is extinction, and we're always sort of like trying to understand from extent species relationships and distributions, whether we talked about some groups having thousands of species and other groups just having a few, or in other cases 100 species and 2 species. And it could be because of both, either because the one had greater speciation events, or it could be because the other one underwent more extinction. Both of these are obviously, in theory, possible. Extinction is largely an ecological process. That is, population goes extinct. When all populations of a particular species go extinct, then the species goes extinct. But the species extinction is a secondary event, is an emergent event. It's basically when, and species extinction and population extinction are only equivalent when there's only one single population of a particular species. There's also, in that context, some of you may have read about the idea of metapopulations, and if you haven't, I'd go back and look at that. But I mean, I don't want to dwell on it over here, but I just want to emphasize that individual populations can go extinct. They can also be revived by dispersals from other populations, right? And so it's when all of your populations of a particular species go extinct by the processes that are affecting them individually, then the species has gone extinct. Now, there is the Red Queen hypothesis, which is from Alice in Wonderland, who says, it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. And this has often been proposed as one of the concepts underlying driving extinction, because if you're not able to adapt, because your competitor, the predators, if you're herbivore, the plants, everyone's trying to do the best for themselves, right? And so in a sense, it's saying that no species can stand still, even though we know certain cases where examples of species that have remained unchanged for millions and millions of years. And often those are known as living fossils. But for the larger part, it might, as a general statement, we can take it to be true that species have to be able to respond to changes in their biotic and abiotic environments. Studies have found that the probability of species becoming extinct is independent of its evolutionary age, but certainly certain taxonomic and ecological groups have been found to have higher rates of extinction. So small/herbivorous mammals have been found to have lower rates of extinctions than large carnivorous groups of mammals. And some of it can come about by deterministic processes, but a lot of this is also driven by chance, and the chance can come from chance events at the genetic level, chance events at the population level. Did you have more sons or daughters? The chance events of mortality, and also environmental stochasticity, which is chance changes in the environment, or periodic changes in the environment that impose costs on animals. Extinction, of course, has also been sort of studied at this macro level, this in the history of life. So there's the Permian Triassic extinctions that wiped out almost all life on Earth. Then there's, of course, the famous Cretaceous tertiary extinctions that led to the disappearance of dinosaurs and many other terrestrial and most marine animals. These based on various pieces of evidence from these iridium deposits and the timing of the extinctions. The discovery of a crater in the Yucatan region is believed to have been because of an asteroid impact. And of course, the most recent one, the Pleistocene hypothesis, which is attributed to the overkill, which is the movement of humans around the world, sort of going and wiping out different faunas. So, as I said, the last part of this is we talked about the evolutionary processes of diversification and dispersal, and the diversification, speciation, and extinction, and we can argue about which one plays a greater role in the distribution and diversity of fauna and flora on Earth, because the idea of motion and change has been thought about for a long time, and not just in the dispersal of plants and animals. In fact, Aristotle talks about nature as the principle of motion and change and the subject of inquiry. But in our subject, we essentially mean the mobility of plants and animals. And it's important that we recognize as I said, dispersal can be an ecological or an evolutionary process. As an ecological process, it's movement away from a location, from its natal location, to get benefits in terms of reduced competition with parents and siblings. The flip side is, as you go further away, habitats may become more dissimilar. And so you have to balance this cost of reducing competition, but also reducing suitability. But its role in biogeography is different from its role as a biodemographic phenomenon. And the question that we ask is, does it result in a change in geographic distribution? So animals may move away from their parental location. Male tiger cubs may migrate away so as not to compete with their fathers, right? But it may not result in the change in tiger distribution. So in biogeography, the question we ask is, does dispersal result in a change in this geographic distribution? Unlike ecological dispersal or ecological movement, which may occur because, elephants, there's dry season, there's more food there, right? And they come back. Every individual may do it. Every male tiger that's born may disperse away from its, from its natal area. But it may not make much difference. On the flip side, here, rare event, it may be a really rare event, but it may dramatically change the distribution of some species. It's therefore infrequent and stochastic, but may be important, like beneficial mutations. In order to expand its range, a species must be able to travel to a new area, withstand potentially unfavorable conditions, and establish viable populations upon arrival. So remember, when we looked at the larger framework, we said, yes, dispersal must occur, but post-dispersal, they must survive or not die. And dispersal is also interesting because we think of barriers to dispersal mostly as physical barriers. That seawater to terrestrial freshwater organisms, mountains, rivers, and so on. But a lot of barriers are also physiological barriers, such as the physical tolerance limits of organisms, the tolerance of saltwater, environmental temperature regimes, physiological barriers, in the ocean, ocean environments, so terrestrial environments as well, of course. But in ocean environments, you get these like sudden changes because of circulation and salinity, sudden changes in temperature regimes. One classic example is the southern tip of Africa. You get these two very strong currents that are going in opposite directions. There's the Benguela current Atlantic side, which is a cold water current, and you get the Agulhas current on the Indian Ocean side, which is a warm water current, and they meet. But this massive temperature difference poses, even though it's just like water and organisms can move, these currents often pose temperatures pose a barrier to the movement of organisms, survival of organisms across these. And then, of course, you can have ecological barriers like competition and predation. There's behavioral and psychological barriers. There's increasing work today on, on the landscape of fear. There's habitat selection and so on. Now, all of these, all of these are important, but as they say, getting there is only half the problem. Once you get there, you also have to sort of like survive and reproduce and and establish yourself. This larger framework that I've talked about is one set of evolutionary processes that influence the diversity and distribution of animals. And the other set of processes, evolutionary processes, so these are think of as evolutionary, ecological, and biogeographic processes. The set are microevolutionary processes, which are occurring at the genetic level in terms of heritability, allele frequency distributions, mutation rates, and so on. Story. I'm sure you've come across, how allele frequencies are maintained in, well, you may not have, but, there's body of work on how allele frequencies are maintained in populations through what's known as the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And what are the factors that could change these allele frequencies, such as mutations, migration, selection, and drift. And there's a substantial sort of emphasis of evolutionary biology also examines the processes at that scale, right? But I just wanted to mention that, and and sort of stop over here, and we'll take some more questions. We'll take some more questions now as well. All burnt out? You had so many questions in the first round. Shoot. Oh, that's a nice long one. Even though observe and name so many persons. Excellent question. So what according to you makes it significant for ecologists studies the interactions, and how could one prove at times it's not by chance? So we'd like to create you're absolutely right that anything I can, for example, I'll give you an example. For the longest time, people said that the tropics have more species because it has more sunlight and more heat, and that leads to greater primary productivity, more plants, blah blah blah, and more species of everything, right? Now, about 20 years ago, somebody proposed a model where they said, oh, if I have a random model where I like randomly throw species onto Earth, I won't go to the details of that model, but I take some species and I sprinkle them across the Earth. Randomly, I will get like the most species in tropical areas because that's where there's, most species overlap in their range. Now that was the product of a random process. And of course, there are certain assumptions inherent in that. And there was a lot of argument still ongoing argument for 20 years about this whole thing. But the question I should ask is, given any observed pattern, could I derive it by some random combination of underlying processes? So, as you say, if I build a model and I find, for example, that let me take a specific one. So we're talking about evolution today. So we're looking at these trees, right? And we are hypothesizing that something led to the diversification, let's say there was a burst in diversification at a particular time. Does that timing correspond to some underlying process that I know? If I put in random processes, that there's random birth and death of species, then what is the curve that I get? And what is the curve that I'm observing? Is that different from something that I would get from a constant speciation extinction model, right? So if I have, for example, something that I'm inferring based on competition and predation, would I get the same observed patterns if I threw them into this model and they had random interactions with each other, right? If random interactions can lead to, in some cases, species A goes up and species B goes down without any competition being inputted into the model, then I'm like, wait a minute, this is, maybe it's come, and certainly if you have small populations of the two, that may happen. So we also are aware that that random processes on small populations can result in, significant differences between species A and B by chance alone. We can't actually infer competition based on just the observed pattern, right? So yes, you're absolutely right that actually we should be in every instance comparing our observed patterns to what we might get by chance. That's part one. And part two, of course, is that we don't believe that any one of these processes may have dominated, or all diversification comes about because of competition or anything like that. That it may be a combination of multiple processes, and that may also vary across taxa and regions, right? So there might be certain processes, body size competition driving body size evolution driving diversification in some groups. The evolution of the ability to use a new habitat in another group, or developing evolutionary innovation like flying, or being able to recolonize water, being able to colonize land. All of these were opportunities for these groups to diversify, but may have been different for different groups. So I don't think there's a case being made that either that there's a group or a factor that drives all this, or B, that that random processes don't have an impact. They absolutely do. And in fact, one of the key ideas in this non-adaptive radiation, in fact, much of it could arise from genetic drift, which is chance changes in small populations, and that could result in divergence as well. What do we refer to when any costs that nature, that the environment or the biotic or abiotic environment poses on an individual, right? It could be anything that prevents you from reproducing. In fact, that could be the presence of predators or competitors, which So when we say the fittest survive, it's fit with respect to a particular cost. I hope that makes sense, right? So it could be just to clarify that the same trait may actually be a benefit in some respects and a cost in others, right? So, for example, I'm fairly tall. Now, this is a great benefit. So, if all of our benefits derived from playing basketball or reaching the food on the top shelf that others could not do, and I won't share it with anybody else, I will definitely have more benefits than everybody. But the same trait becomes a cost when you're traveling by air, especially long distance international flights. I think we would definitely select eventually for being shorter if all of us were taking international flights, and that influenced our reproductive fitness. So just as a bit of a joke, but the fact is that being tall or being fast or being something, being big, and the same example as being tall, but being big has both been a cost and a benefit. So there are animals that have evolved to become smaller, and there are animals that have evolved to become species that have evolved to become larger, right? Because there's largeness is beneficial in certain contexts, smallness is beneficial in other contexts. And nope, I don't think nature benefits at all. I don't think this is, in the sense that there's no overarching benefit as such for nature. Unless we can say that nature gets a lot of publicity by being responsible for natural selection. Are there any other questions? So if you have any questions from YouTube?
No, there isn't any on YouTube.
Okay. All right. So we'll suggest some books. I saw this the question again about evolutionary biology books. So there are a lot of popular books. I definitely would recommend the ones by Richard Dawkins. There are many books by Richard Dawkins. There's his older ones like The Selfish Gene and Blind Watchmaker are really classics. I would definitely recommend those. There's again a huge body of books by Stephen Jay Gould, which are, he wrote a column every month for some 30 odd years in a magazine called Natural History, and a lot of that is compiled into, and he wrote independently books as well, and those are really interesting reading. There's another writer called Matt Ridley, who's written some books on evolution. There's a really nice popular book. It's a bit more heavy reading, but there's Daniel Dennett's book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Another very, very nice book, but a little bit more intense than the others. The more recent Dawkins books are very nice as well. I'm not remembering others off the top of my head. There's also good textbooks, but if you guys want like textbook type things, I think we might be able to, if you guys send a request, maybe, I don't know if you have like a, some prescribed reading listed somewhere on the CES website, but otherwise we could send it across to your group. But as far as popular books are concerned, those are some of the ones that I remember off the top of my head. Sarwan, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your previous insight. My question is adding on to my previous question. It's just that you said people tried creating random distributions and wanted to see if they could generate the pattern which is like observed in nature. But what if I create a random distribution and then see that that pattern is being observed from the random distributions as well and in nature as well. But we also see some ecological parameters or factors which we can provide as an evidence for that distribution. Then how confidently can we use the null distribution to rule out the fact? That is a little confusing.
Again, this is the core of of 2 or 3 major arguments that have happened in ecology and evolution in the last 30 to 40 years, right? And the people creating the models are at one scale, they are saying that, like, look, it's a bit like saying, if I put my hand into the bag and pull out, marbles that or colored balls that I pull out, that I randomly pull out more red than blue balls because that's what's found in the distribution, right? And it's a bit like saying, but he also likes red balls. Maybe I do, but that has nothing to do with the fact that I'm getting this pattern, right? So do you see what I mean? That you can sometimes have a factor that appears to explain something, but maybe doesn't. So all this time you kept giving me, like, whenever you saw me, I'm like, I have, let me give you a better example, an animal example, right? Let's say I go out and watch a bunch of lizards in some landscape. They're always sitting on rocks. And I'm like, yeah, this lizard, in fact, outside Bangalore, you'll see this rock agama, right? I mean, I don't know where you guys are all from, but there's outside Bangalore, in the region outside, there's this large agamid lizard called Samophilus, or the rock agama, which you see sitting on rocks all the time. And I could come to a conclusion from that these agamid lizards like rocks. But if I went out and sampled the habitat and found that 90% of the habitat is rocks and there's only 10% is other substrates, then even randomly, if I were to just, through a model or physically throw, put these in places, I would 90% of the time I would see them on rocks, right? That's a product of chance, really, or not of selection. That they are not selecting the rocks; they're randomly distributed. But because of the underlying substrate, the 90% of the time they're seen on rocks. Does that make sense? That observed preferences may not reflect, observed patterns may not reflect underlying mechanisms. And also, the processes that occur at certain scales may not influence patterns at other scales. So it may very well be true that plants grow faster when there's more at higher temperatures and when there's more water, something like that. That may be true for all individual plants. But when I look at a set of patterns that are influenced by, let's say, random dispersal events, random, historical biogeographic events, and I bring in randomness from that, it may overcome this ecological signal, right? And therefore, the larger scale pattern may be influenced by randomness at a different scale. Or it may be influenced by a deterministic process at a different scale as well, right? So those are the things that we work to disentangle, and it's not always easy. Thought I saw another question. Venu, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand up.
Yes, sir. So, we know today that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors. Many recent studies also suggest using stone tools, sign language communication with humans, etc., in bonobos and orangutans. What is your opinion on the possibility of the evolution of bonobos and chimpanzees into human or subhuman forms in the coming million years?
Can I tell you after it's happened?
Yes.
No, yeah, one of the things that I think is particularly hard to predict is the course that evolution will take, right? And this is because, different organisms have remained static for, some have remained static for 100,000 years, some have remained static for 1,000,000 years, some have remained static for 100 million years. And so we don't know how long and what triggers there are to change. So even if you look at human evolution, there's 1,000,000+ years or 3 million years of hominid evolution, and then there's 250,000 years of stone tool use, right? There's the Paleolithic age, and then suddenly everything dramatically picks up 50,000 years ago, and then there's another shift 10,000 years ago, and one more 3,000. So the way that human evolution has also proceeded has not been linear at all, right? There's been long periods of stasis, and suddenly, like in recent times, it's sort of like it's dramatically taken off in a particular direction. So and this is true to a degree with other organisms, I mean, including viruses, for example. So we don't, it's hard to kind of make predictions about what directions particular individual lineages will take. But yeah, I mean, I guess a safe answer is why not? All right. Sophia, I'm not seeing questions on the chat, or I don't see any hands up.
I don't see any idea.
Yeah. All right. So thanks, guys. Thanks for all the participating in the small exercises and for all the questions. Feel free to email us if you have more questions or or feedback, and we'll see you all again in the next session. Bye-bye. Madhushree, you just put your hand up. I'm still here, so go ahead if you want to ask something.
Hello, yes, sir. Sir, I have a question regarding like climate change, and as the heat temperature of our Earth is getting warmer and warmer, and due to these extreme like weather patterns, we are much becoming like a tropical region climate, like extreme summer or extreme winter in a tropical region also, like temperate. So, sir, are our plant vegetations can become like C4 plants, our tropical region have C3 plants are dominated in a tropical region, right, sir? Like whereas temperate we come, there are C4 and CAM in deserts. So is it possible like homogenization of all these plants to C4 as the temperature is rising, and the C3 plants might get extinct due to like extreme weather patterns?
Well, see, I'm not going to sort of like get into the details of this because there's a lot of work out there, but one of the consequences that people have seen, the natural consequences of changing climate, and it could be increasing temperatures, increasing extreme weather events, is of movement of animals, right? So plants and animals that are able to move may change their distributions and ranges. Now, at a really large scale, I imagine that would take, and there's also limits to how far they can go. So this, what we learned from biogeography also, is that like I can model, and say that in 100 years time, the appropriate climate for some, because temperature has gone up, appropriate climate for some frog in, like southern Western Ghats. It's become too warm there. The appropriate climate is there, like somewhere in northern Western Ghats. But can it reach there? It has not reached there even in, in evolutionary time, right? Because the biogeography tells me that these frogs on different mountains have been separated by millions of years. So millions, not just, thousands or hundreds, or like this is now we're talking about tens of years scale. So I think that the changes that come about due to climate change, the more immediate ones are not because of evolution, which take much longer periods of time, but of changes in distribution, which can happen much shorter periods of time. But even there are limits to changes in distribution as well. So that's the broad answer that I would give to that question in terms of, homogenization of tropical and temperate regions. But certainly habitats become conducive for species that were not found there before, and they may be able to outcompete local species that were there. So it's quite possible that we'll see changes, of the sort that you're mentioning. You may see loss of diversity because certain species come in, they're invasive, they're great aggressive competitors, and and there is the resident fauna and flora are unable to sort of compete with those organisms. So yeah, I mean, I do think some of those processes may underlie, but more specifically than that, I'm not sure we can really predict.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Karthik, we have another question.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
So I have one follow-up question from what the last participant asked. So for olive ridley, for turtles, sea turtles, we know that the coastal temperatures are increasing, and the eggs hatch their fertility, the fidelity that depends on the coastal temperature. So as the temperature goes up, do we expect the turtles to shift their nesting habitat to the places which are more favorable? Or is it that there is also a limitation on the distribution? Their migration and choosing a new location?
Yeah, so that is a question that we've asked ourselves as well. Because sea turtles tend to return to their natal beaches, the prospects for they don't kind of like see. There are other animals that may nest in certain areas, and they may select those areas based on the suitability, right? They may build a nest based on like the temperature that they find. Sea turtles aren't doing that. Sea turtles are largely going back to the beaches where they were born. Over evolutionary time, they may have shifted tens of thousands of years. Some will do better than others, and therefore those that accidentally find beaches that are like more suitable may end up producing more offspring. But on a shorter time scale, they're more or less going back to the beaches where they were born, or the regional areas. And therefore, we don't expect shifts in distribution to necessarily come about because of shifts in temperature. We might expect more a shift in phenology. They might be able to nest at hotter or cooler times of the year. But that also we're not very sure that they're doing. The problem is that only now are there data sets that are long enough, data sets going back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, on the basis of which people can actually make inferences about whether they're responding to these temperature changes or not. So, yeah.
And so for specifically olive ridley turtles, we have seen the timing of Aribada, the mass nesting, has been shifting to the hotter months.
Doesn't make any sense, no?
Right. It should move to the which is more suitable.
Yeah.
Where the ratio is 50-50. So, but that's not happening.
I don't know. That's actually that's the information that we've been collecting for the last 20 years, and that's kind of what it looks like. So we don't really know.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sophia, thanks. I think we can wrap this up, yeah?
Let's do that.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to email me if you have more questions.